You know, I want to start today by acknowledging something that might feel a little uncomfortable at first. If you're watching this, chances are you've spent years, maybe decades, trying to do the right thing for your heart. You've probably cut back on red meat at some point. Maybe you take a statin. You show up for your annual checkups. You might even wear one of those watches that tracks your heart rate while you sleep. And I want to be clear, none of that makes you foolish. It makes you responsible. It makes you someone who cares about staying healthy, staying independent, staying here for the people you love. But here's what I've come to understand after more than 30 years of practicing medicine, most of it spent caring for adults over 60. Some of the habits we've been told are essential habits that sound not just reasonable, but virtuous, can quietly work against us as we age. Not because they're inherently bad, but because the body at 67 is not the body at 42, and medicine, unfortunately, hasn't always caught up with that distinction. Today I want to talk about one particular habit. It's something millions of older adults do every year, often at the encouragement of their doctors, their families, sometimes even their own anxiety. On the surface, it looks like prevention. It feels like protection. But in practice, and I've seen this more times than I wish I had, it can lead to unnecessary procedures, medications that create new problems, and a kind of quiet fear that chips away at the very quality of life we're trying to preserve. I'm going to walk you through why this happens. I'm going to share some stories from my own practice, names changed, of course, but the situations are real. And I'm going to explain what the research actually tells us, not in the way it gets summarized in headlines, but in the way it applies to someone living in a real body, at a real age, with a real life to protect. Let me tell you what we'll cover. First, I'll explain how the aging heart is fundamentally different from a younger heart, and why that matters more than most people realize. Second, I'll talk about the habit itself, routine cardiac screening in the absence of symptoms, stress tests, calcium scores, imaging that gets ordered almost reflexively, sometimes just because a birthday passed. Third, I'll walk through what actually happens when these tests find something, because they almost always find something, and that's where the trouble often begins. And finally, I'll offer a different way of thinking about heart health after 60, one that's grounded not in fear, but in function, not in numbers, but in how you actually live. So let's begin. One of the most persistent myths in medicine is the idea that the older heart is essentially a failing heart. That if you're 73 and your heart isn't performing like it did at 50, something must be wrong. But that's not how the heart works. That's not how any organ works. The heart changes with age. The walls thicken slightly. The valves stiffen. The electrical system slows down just a little. The maximum heart rate you can achieve during exertion naturally declines. These are not diseases. These are adaptations. They're part of how the body adjusts to decades of living. Now, does that mean we should ignore the heart entirely? Of course not. Symptoms matter. Chest pain matters. Shortness of breath that's new or worsening that matters. Fainting matters. These are signals that something might be wrong, and they deserve evaluation. But here's where modern medicine has gotten a little tangled up in itself. We've developed incredibly powerful tools to look at the heart: CT scanners, nuclear imaging, echocardiograms, stress tests with all sorts of variations. And these tools are remarkable. They can detect blockages, measure blood flow, identify structural abnormalities. The problem is that they're too good. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you take a 68-year-old person who feels fine, no chest pain, no shortness of breath, no limitations in daily activity, and you put them through a cardiac stress test or a coronary calcium scan, you are almost guaranteed to find something. A minor irregularity, a slightly elevated calcium score, a borderline narrowing in one of the arteries. These findings exist in millions of older adults who will never have a heart attack. They're part of normal aging. But once they're documented, once they're written in a chart, they become something else. They become a problem that someone feels obligated to solve. and that's where the cascade begins. Let me describe what I see in my practice all the time. A patient comes in for a routine visit. They're 64, maybe 70. They feel fine. Maybe they've been a little more tired than usual, or they notice their legs are stiffer in the morning. Normal things, aging things. But somewhere in the conversation, the question comes up. Shouldn't I get my heart checked just to be safe? And I understand that question. I really do. It comes from a good place. It comes from wanting to catch something early, from believing that more information is always better. But here's the problem. In the absence of symptoms, routine cardiac screening in older adults does not reduce heart attacks. It does not extend life. This has been studied extensively. The COURAGE trial, the ischemia trial. These were large, rigorous studies that asked a simple question. If we find blockages in people who aren't having symptoms, and we fix those blockages with stents or surgery, do they live longer? Do they have fewer heart attacks? The answer, again and again, was no. Not because the procedures don't work. They do work in the right situation. Someone having a heart attack or experiencing unstable chest pain absolutely benefits from intervention. That's not the question. The question is whether scanning and intervening in stable, asymptomatic people provides benefit. And the evidence says it largely doesn't. But something else does happen, something the studies don't always capture. Once you find something, even something minor, it's very hard to leave it alone. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Bernard. He was 71 when I first met him, retired postal worker, walked 3 miles a day, rain or shine, took care of his grandchildren twice a week. No chest pain, no shortness of breath, just a guy living his life. At his annual physical, not with me, with another physician, he was offered a coronary calcium scan. Just to see where you stand, the doctor said. Bernard thought it sounded reasonable. The scan came back showing a calcium score in the moderate range. Not alarming, but elevated. His doctor referred him to a cardiologist. The cardiologist, following a fairly standard protocol, ordered a nuclear stress test. The stress test showed a small area of reduced blood flow, not severe, but it was there, on the image, in black and white. Now things started to move faster. The cardiologist recommended a cardiac catheterization, a more invasive test where dye is injected into the arteries to look for blockages directly. Bernard agreed. He was nervous, but he trusted the process. The catheterization found a 50% blockage in one of his arteries. Not enough to require a stent, technically. But the cardiologist mentioned it might be worth watching closely. Bernard left the hospital with 2 new medications, instructions to come back in 6 months, and a sense of dread he hadn't had before. 6 months later, he told me he'd stopped walking as much. He was afraid of pushing his heart. His grandchildren noticed he seemed more withdrawn. His wife said he'd started checking his pulse several times a day. This is what I mean when I talk about harm that doesn't show up in statistics. Bernard didn't have a heart attack. He didn't need emergency surgery. But his life got smaller. His confidence shrank. And none of it was necessary. That 50% blockage, it was almost certainly there for years before the scan. It might never have caused a problem. But now, it was the center of his life. There's a reason this happens more often to people over 60. Several reasons, actually. First, older adults are more likely to have findings on imaging, not because they're sicker, but because they've lived longer. Calcium accumulates, arteries stiffen, the heart shows its age. These are expected changes, but they get flagged as abnormalities. Second, older adults often have more trust in medical authority. They come from a generation that respected doctors, followed recommendations, didn't question the process. That trust is beautiful in many ways, but it also means they're less likely to push back when a test leads to another test, leads to a procedure they didn't need. Third, and this is hard to say, but I believe it's true, the medical system is not designed to leave things alone. There are financial incentives for testing. There are legal fears about missing something. There's a culture that equates doing more with doing better. I don't say this to vilify anyone. Most cardiologists I know are decent, hard-working people who genuinely want to help, but they're operating within a system that rewards action, not restraint. And that system doesn't always serve older patients well. Here's what I tell my patients, especially the ones who come in worried because they read something online or because a friend had a heart attack and now they're scared. The best measure of your heart's health is not a scan. It's not a number. It's how you feel when you're living your life. Can you walk up a flight of stairs without stopping? Can you carry groceries from the car? Can you play with your grandchildren or garden or do whatever activities bring you joy? If the answer is yes, if your heart is supporting your life, then your heart is working. Now, does that mean you ignore symptoms? Absolutely not. If you develop chest pain, especially with exertion, that's a reason to talk to your doctor. If you suddenly can't do things you could do a month ago, that's worth investigating. If you faint or feel your heart racing in a way that's new and frightening, those are real signals. But the routine stress test every year or two, just because you're over 60, the calcium scan because a clinic offered it, these are not prevention. They're a fishing expedition. And when you go fishing in an older body, you will catch something. The question is whether catching it helps you or hurts you. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Dorothy. She was 78 when she came to me for the first time after moving closer to her daughter. Lovely woman, retired school teacher, sharp as a tack, though she joked that her memory wasn't what it used to be. Her previous doctor had ordered a stress test the year before. It showed some mild abnormalities. She'd been sent to a cardiologist who recommended a catheterization. Dorothy had declined. She told me she just had a feeling it wasn't right for her. When I reviewed her records, I understood why she'd hesitated. She had no symptoms. None. Her blood pressure was well controlled. She walked every day. Her biggest health complaint was occasional heartburn. The stress test finding? Almost certainly a false positive. These tests are less accurate in older adults, particularly older women. The specificity drops. The chance of a misleading result goes up. If Dorothy had gone through with the catheterization, she would have faced real risks: bleeding, kidney damage from the dye, a small but real chance of stroke, all to investigate a finding that was probably meaningless. Instead, she listened to her instincts. She kept walking. She kept teaching Sunday school. She's 83 now and doing fine. I'm not saying everyone should refuse testing. I'm saying the decision deserves thought. It deserves context. It deserves a conversation that includes not just what we might find, but what we might lose. So if routine screening isn't the answer, what is? Let me share what I've learned actually matters for heart health after 60. First, movement. Not extreme exercise, not marathon training, just regular, consistent, enjoyable movement. Walking is wonderful. Swimming is gentle on the joints. Gardening counts. Dancing counts. The heart is a muscle, and muscles need to be used. Second, connection. There's fascinating research on loneliness and heart disease. Social isolation is a genuine cardiovascular risk factor. The people who stay healthiest aren't always the ones with the best cholesterol numbers. They're often the ones who have someone to talk to, something to look forward to, a reason to get up in the morning. Third, sleep. This gets overlooked. Poor sleep drives inflammation, raises blood pressure, and makes everything harder. If you're waking up exhausted, if you're snoring heavily and stopping breathing, those are things worth addressing. Not with a stress test, but with a sleep evaluation. Fourth, and this is the one people don't want to hear, acceptance. Accepting that you're not 30 anymore. Accepting that your heart will show its age on any scan you take. Accepting that living well matters more than living perfectly. If your doctor recommends a heart test, here are some questions worth asking, not to be difficult, but to understand. What are we looking for? Is this because I have symptoms, or is this routine screening? What happens if we find something? Will it change my treatment? Will it lead to more tests? What are the risks of those tests? What happens if we don't do this test? What would we miss? How likely is that? Is this test accurate for someone my age? Are there higher false positive rates in older adults? And perhaps most importantly, if you were my age and you felt the way I feel, would you do this test? That last question usually gets an honest answer. I've spent more than 3 decades listening to hearts. I've held the hands of patients who were dying. I've celebrated with patients who outlived every expectation. And I've watched, more often than I'd like, as fear and overtreatment stole something precious from people who had every reason to live well. Protecting your heart after 60 is not about catching every potential problem before it becomes real. It's about nurturing the life your heart supports. It's about walking outside because the air feels good and your legs still work. It's about eating meals with people you love, even if those meals aren't perfectly optimized for cardiovascular wellness. It's about refusing to let a number on a scan define whether you're healthy or sick. Your heart has carried you through decades. It's adapted, adjusted, kept beating through stress and joy and grief and laughter. It doesn't need constant surveillance. It needs respect. I want to leave you with something to consider. The next time someone suggests a test, a scan, a procedure, and they may have good reasons, I'm not saying to refuse everything. Pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what problem am I trying to solve? If there's a real symptom, a real limitation, a real concern, then investigation might make sense. But if the answer is just to be safe, or because you're at that age, or because we do this for everyone over 65, that's not a good enough reason. You have the right to ask questions. You have the right to say, let me think about it. You have the right to prioritize your quality of life over medical completeness. This isn't about rejecting medicine. Medicine has given us remarkable things, but wisdom is knowing when to use those tools and when to set them down. Your heart, right now, is beating. It's doing its job. If it weren't, you'd probably know. Trust that a little more. Fear it a little less. If any of this resonated with you, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Maybe you've had an experience with testing that didn't go the way you expected. Maybe you've questioned a recommendation and wondered if you were wrong to do so. Leave a comment if you're comfortable sharing. I do read them, and I learn from them. Take care of yourselves. Not with fear, with thought. I'll see you in the next one.